They fired him in front of everyone, marched him out of the building like a criminal while his 6-year-old daughter watched from the lobby. The engineers laughed. The executives signed the paperwork before lunch. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked twice at the quiet guy in the gray shirt who kept his head down and fixed things nobody else could fix. 3 days later, the most expensive engine in Titan Automotive's history exploded in front of every investor, every camera, and every journalist in the country. And the only person alive who knew exactly why was the man they'd just thrown away. If you're watching this, drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The alarm went off at 5:15, same as always. Nolan Pierce didn't slam it. He didn't groan or pull the pillow over his face. He just reached over, clicked the button, and lay still for about 30 seconds, staring at the ceiling in the dark. It was a habit he'd developed over the years. Not meditation, nothing that fancy. Just 30 seconds of quiet before the day got loud. He could hear Emma breathing through the baby monitor. She was 6, way too old for a baby monitor, and she'd told him so herself 2 weeks ago with the kind of firm, hands-on-hips authority that made him bite the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. "I'm not a baby, Daddy." He'd nodded seriously and agreed. The monitor stayed. He got up, moved through the dark apartment by memory. Step over the squeaky floorboard near the bathroom door, don't knock the toolbox he'd left in the hallway Tuesday and hadn't put away yet. The kitchen light flickered when he hit the switch. Fluorescent. He'd been meaning to replace it with an LED strip for 6 months. Somehow, there was always something else. Coffee first, then lunches. Emma's lunch was the more important project. She'd gone through a phase of trading her apple slices for somebody named Diego's chocolate pudding cups, a situation Nolan had discovered only when the school called, and he'd handled it by asking her straight up what the deal was instead of making it a whole thing. She'd explained very patiently that apples were boring and pudding was not. He'd started cutting the apple slices thinner and adding cinnamon. Diego kept his pudding. Problem solved. He packed turkey on wheat, the apple slices, a small bag of pretzels, and a note. He always put a note in. Some days it was a joke, bad ones mostly, the kind that made Emma cover her face with both hands and say, "Daddy, no." And some days it was just a drawing of whatever she'd been into that week. This week, it was dinosaurs. He sketched a T-Rex in ballpoint pen on a Post-it note, gave it a speech bubble that said "Roar means I love you," and folded it on top of the pretzels. His own lunch was a sandwich he made in about 45 seconds. By 5:50, he was showered, dressed in his gray Titan Automotive work shirt, the one with the small logo above the breast pocket, the one that had been through the wash enough times that the logo had started to crack at the edges, and sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and a notebook. Not a journal, just a notebook he used to sketch things out. Ideas, mostly. Diagrams. Observations he'd made during the day that he wanted to think through later. He'd filled 11 of them in the past 4 years. Titan Automotive's main facility sat at the edge of Garrett City, a sprawl of gray concrete and clean glass that looked impressive from the highway and felt like a machine from the inside. Which it was, technically. Every floor, every department, every process had been designed for efficiency. Isabella Sterling had overseen the redesign herself when she'd taken the CEO position 2 years ago at 28, the youngest chief executive in the company's history, a fact that the business press had not stopped mentioning since the announcement. Nolan had read the profile piece about her in the break room. Someone had left the magazine on the table, open to the photo. Isabella in a tailored blazer, standing in front of a prototype frame, looking at the camera with the kind of steady confidence that either came naturally or took years to manufacture. The headline called her "The Future of American Manufacturing." Someone had written, "Yeah, right in pen in the margin." Nolan had closed the magazine and put it back. He didn't have strong feelings about Isabella Sterling either way. He'd never met her. She occupied a floor of the building he'd never been to. He worked in Sub-Level 2, the Maintenance and Systems Division, the people who kept the machines running. His official title was Senior Maintenance Technician, which meant he diagnosed problems, repaired equipment, and handled the kind of technical issues that stumped the junior staff. He was good at it, reliable. He showed up on time, didn't complain, and had a way of looking at a broken system, mechanical, electrical, software, didn't matter, and finding the problem without a lot of drama. His supervisor, a thick-necked man named Roy Chambers, had once told him during a performance review that he was the best technician on the floor and the worst at making sure people know it. Nolan had taken it as a compliment. He didn't need people to know things. He needed the machines to work. The thing was, though, Nolan knew more about those machines than his job title suggested. A lot more. He knew because he'd helped design part of the system they ran on. He hadn't told Roy that. He hadn't told anyone at Titan. It was a long story, and not one he went over much anymore. The short version was this. 8 years ago, Nolan had been in a different place entirely. 24 years old, 2 years out of a mechanical engineering program at a state university, working for a small R&D firm called Vance Systems. It wasn't a glamorous job. The company was underfunded and had a reputation in the industry for being ambitious beyond its means. But the work was interesting, genuinely interesting. The kind of work that kept him up at night, not from stress, but because his brain wouldn't stop turning over problems. He'd been part of a small team working on a combustion optimization concept. The idea was a modular engine architecture, a system where the core components could be calibrated and reconfigured without tearing down the whole engine. It was the kind of engineering that, if it worked, would change how automotive companies approached both performance and maintenance. Nolan had contributed the calibration framework, the logic that governed how the components talked to each other. It wasn't glamorous work. It was math and schematics, and a lot of late nights arguing with a colleague named Dennis about tolerances, but it was his. Then Vance Systems went under. The firm's assets, designs, documentation, prototypes, were sold in pieces during bankruptcy proceedings. Some of it went to individual buyers. Some of it disappeared into the machinery of acquisition deals Nolan didn't have the resources or the standing to track. He'd moved on. Had to. His wife, Claire, was pregnant with Emma. He needed stable work. He took a job at a larger company, moved into operations rather than design, and gradually shifted from the guy who builds the system to the guy who keeps it running. He told himself it was fine. Most days, it was fine. 3 years ago, when he'd applied to Titan Automotive and landed the maintenance position, he'd walked into the facility and felt something stop in his chest. The engine architecture in the test bays, the frame, the configuration logic, the way the calibration system was structured. It was familiar in the way your own handwriting is familiar. Not identical. Modified. Developed further. But the bones of it were bones he recognized. He hadn't said anything. He was 32 years old, raising a 6-year-old alone, and he had a mortgage on a small apartment and a daughter who needed new shoes every 4 months because she wouldn't stop growing. He wasn't a crusader. He wasn't looking for a fight. He just needed the job. The morning everything came apart started like every other morning. Nolan clocked in at 6:45, ran through the daily diagnostics on the sub-level 2 systems, signed off on a parts requisition for the hydraulic press in Bay 4, and got himself a second coffee from the machine in the hallway that everyone complained about, but nobody reported to maintenance because they all figured maintenance would just laugh. He was halfway through reviewing the calibration logs from the overnight run when he found it. It wasn't obvious. If you weren't looking for it specifically, if you didn't know the system the way Nolan knew it, you'd miss it completely. It was a variance in the modulation cycle, small, recurring, the kind of thing that in isolation looked like normal mechanical fluctuation. But Nolan had been watching the logs for 3 weeks, and the pattern was clear to him. The variance wasn't random, it was systematic, and it was getting worse. He sat with it for about 20 minutes, working through the math in his notebook, before he understood what he was looking at. The prototype engine, the one they were building toward the big investor demonstration in 2 weeks, had a flaw in its calibration architecture. Specifically, a key setting in the synchronization layer had been altered from its base parameters. Not enough to cause obvious problems during standard testing, but under the conditions of a live demonstration, sustained high output, thermal stress, the kind of performance the engineers would push for in front of cameras, the modified setting would create a cascade failure in the modulation cycle. The engine would shut down, not gradually, violently. Nolan stared at his notebook for a long moment. Then he wrote up the report. He was thorough. He always was. He documented the variance pattern, traced the calibration log history to identify when the alteration had been made, and outlined exactly what he believed would happen if the setting wasn't corrected before the demonstration. He attached the relevant log files and flagged it as urgent. He submitted it through the official internal reporting system at 9:17 a.m. and sent a copy directly to Roy's inbox. Roy called him into his office at 9:40. "Close the door," Roy said. Nolan closed the door. Roy was behind his desk, his expression doing something complicated. Not angry, exactly, more like the look of a man who has received news he very much didn't want. "I read your report," Roy said. "Okay. You're saying the prototype is going to fail." "I'm saying the calibration setting is wrong, and if it's not corrected, yes, it's going to fail under demonstration conditions." Roy rubbed the back of his neck. "Nolan, you're a maintenance tech." "I know what I am. The engineering team has been over this engine for 18 months. Their lead engineer has signed off on every system." "Then their lead engineer missed it, or—" Nolan stopped himself, chose his next words carefully. "The log shows the alteration was made 4 weeks ago. That's after the last formal review." "You're saying someone changed it on purpose." "I'm saying it was changed. I don't know why. That's why I flagged it." Roy was quiet for a moment. He looked at his monitor, then back at Nolan, then at some point roughly between the two. "I'm going to pass this up, but Nolan, I'm telling you, man to man, if you're wrong about this, it's going to look bad." "I'm not wrong. And if you're right, it's still going to look bad, because you just told the company their $18 million prototype is broken 2 weeks before the biggest demo in their history." Nolan looked at him. "Would you rather I didn't tell you?" Roy didn't answer that. He turned back to his monitor. "I'll pass it up. Go back to your station." He found out 3 days later that the report had gone nowhere. It wasn't Roy's fault, or not entirely. The report had gone up through channels, reached the desk of Victor Lang, Senior VP of Engineering Development, and been reviewed and dismissed. The official response, which Roy relayed to Nolan with the careful neutrality of a man delivering news he didn't write, was that the calibration variance had been reviewed by the engineering team and determined to be within acceptable parameters. Nolan asked to see the review findings. Roy told him that wasn't how it worked. "I want to submit a formal follow-up," Nolan said. "I'd leave it alone," Roy said. "I don't want to leave it alone. The engine is going to fail, Roy." Roy's expression tightened. "Nolan, I'm going to be straight with you. The feedback I'm getting from upstairs is that your report created some noise. People are asking why a maintenance tech is telling the engineering division how to do their job. I'm not saying I agree with that framing. I'm saying that's what's happening." Nolan was quiet. "Leave it alone," Roy said again. 2 weeks, the demo happens. Everyone moves on." Nolan went back to his station. He sat at his workbench. He thought about Emma, about the school pickup at 3:30, about the model airplane kit she'd asked about at the hardware store last weekend, about the note in her lunchbox. He submitted the follow-up report at 2 p.m. He was called upstairs the next morning, not to Roy's office, to the 4th floor, which was further upstairs than he'd ever been summoned. He rode the elevator in his gray shirt and his steel-toed boots, past the lobby with its framed product history wall, past the glass-walled conference rooms where he could see people in suits moving around with coffee cups and tablets. The HR office on 4 was clean and quiet. A woman named Sandra Cho, who had the kind of careful professional warmth that Nolan associated with people who had learned to deliver bad news efficiently, gestured him to a chair across from her desk. Beside her stood a man Nolan didn't recognize. Younger, in a dark blazer, holding a folder. And standing near the window, not sitting, was Victor Lang. Nolan knew who Victor was by reputation. He was one of those men who had the institutional weight of the company behind him in every room he walked into. 60s. Silver-haired, built like someone who had once been athletic and still believed it. He was looking at Nolan the way you look at something mildly annoying that you've decided to deal with. "Mr. Pierce," Sandra said, "thank you for coming up." "Sure. I want to be direct with you about why we've asked you here." She glanced briefly at the folder the younger man was holding. "Over the past week, you submitted 2 unauthorized technical reports regarding the Titan 12 prototype that created significant disruption within the engineering division. They weren't unauthorized, Nolan said. I used the official internal reporting system. You submitted reports outside your area of technical responsibility, Victor said. He had the voice of a man who expected to be the last one to speak. Your role is maintenance. You don't have authorization to evaluate prototype engineering systems. My role is to monitor system performance and flag anomalies. That's literally in my job description. Victor's expression didn't change. You submitted reports suggesting that our engineering team had missed a critical flaw. Reports that, I'll remind you, our lead engineers reviewed and dismissed. I know they dismissed them. I'm telling you they were wrong to. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone says the wrong thing to the wrong person. Sandra cleared her throat. Mr. Pierce, there's a secondary concern we need to address. She opened a folder of her own. Over the past several months, there have been concerns raised about your conduct on the floor, specifically about unauthorized access to engineering documentation and system logs beyond your clearance level. Nolan went still. I access the diagnostic logs. That's my job. There are logs of access to prototype calibration files you don't have authorization to view. Those logs are part of the diagnostic system. I was tracking a variance pattern. Mr. Pierce, Sandra's voice was still careful, still warm, still delivering bad news efficiently. Taking everything into consideration, Titan Automotive has made the decision to terminate your employment, effective immediately. We believe this is in the best interest of both parties. The younger man in the blazer placed a document on the desk in front of Nolan. Nolan looked at it, didn't touch it. You're firing me, he said. Not a question, just saying it out loud. We're releasing you from your contract, Sandra said, with 2 weeks severance in recognition of your 3 years of service. Because I reported a flaw in an engine that is going to fail. Victor took a step forward from the window. He wasn't a tall man, but he occupied space the way certain men do, like the room belongs to them. Because you overstepped your role, created internal disruption, and accessed materials you weren't authorized to access. That's why. He paused. Sign the document, Mr. Pierce. Let's not make this difficult. Nolan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at Sandra. My daughter is in the lobby, he said. She had a half day at school. I couldn't get anyone to... He stopped. She's 6. She's sitting down there. Sandra's professional warmth flickered slightly. Of course. Security will escort you down. I don't need an escort. It's standard procedure for... I heard you. He stood, picked up the document without signing it. I'll look this over. Emma was in the lobby, sitting in one of the chairs near the reception desk with a backpack in her lap that was decorated with iron-on patches of cartoon planets. She was talking to the receptionist, a young woman named Keely, who was leaning on her elbow and listening with what appeared to be genuine interest. Emma had that effect on people. When she saw Nolan, she slid off the chair, grabbed her backpack, and crossed to him. Daddy, did you know that Saturn has 62 moons, but scientists think there might be more? Keely told me. That's a lot of moons, Nolan said. I told her the most important one is probably Titan because of the nitrogen atmosphere. She glanced up at him. Why are you carrying your notebook? He had his notebook in his hand and his jacket, which he'd grabbed from the hook in his locker in the 3 minutes between the HR office and down here. He hadn't packed anything else. There wasn't anything else. I'm done for today, he said. It's not even lunch. I know. He took her hand and they walked toward the door. He was aware of people watching, the receptionist, a cluster of guys from the operations floor who happened to be passing through the lobby, 2 women from accounts who had paused near the elevators. He didn't look at any of them. He kept his eyes on the door and kept walking, Emma's hand in his, her backpack bouncing slightly with her steps. Behind him, he heard someone say something low to someone else and a short, ugly laugh. He pushed through the glass doors into the gray November air and didn't look back. Emma walked beside him in silence for a moment. She was perceptive. She'd always been perceptive, a quality that sometimes felt like a gift and sometimes felt like a weight, because it meant you couldn't really hide things from her, not completely. She looked at his face as they walked toward the car. Are you fired? She asked. He considered lying, decided against it. Yeah, Bug. I am. She processed this for a few steps. Because of the thing you found wrong with the engine? He glanced down at her. How do you know about that? You were writing about it in your notebook for a week. You always write in your notebook when something is wrong that nobody will listen to. She said it simply, factually, the way 6-year-olds sometimes say true things that take adults years to understand. Then she slipped her hand more firmly into his. Okay, what are we going to do? He looked at her, the cartoon planets on her backpack, the gap in her teeth where she'd lost a baby tooth 3 weeks ago and was very proud of. We're going to get lunch, he said, somewhere better than your sandwich. Diego's mom makes churros, Emma said immediately. We're not going to Diego's house. He wouldn't mind. Emma. Fine, she considered. There's a taco place on 5th. There's a taco place on 5th, he agreed. They got to the car. A 10-year-old Civic with a cracked dashboard and a back seat that had a permanent impression in the upholstery from Emma's booster seat. He got her buckled, put his notebook in the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel for a second without starting it. The November air had turned the windshield slightly fogged at the edges. Through the glass, the Titan Automotive building was a rectangle of gray concrete and fluorescent light, indifferent and large. He thought about the variance pattern, the calibration logs, the cascade failure that was coming. He thought about the fact that it was going to happen anyway, and there was nothing he could do about it, and it was not his problem anymore. He started the car. The next 3 days had the disorienting quality that unemployment always has in its first week. The sense of time moving differently, hours stretching in the morning when there's no alarm, the specific anxiety of afternoons that used to be structured and now aren't. He called the state unemployment office and sat on hold for 45 minutes. He updated his resume, which required him to look at his credentials on paper, his actual background, the engineering program, the work advanced systems, the skills he'd spent 15 years accumulating, and feel the peculiar vertigo of knowing that his job title at the place that had just fired him had been a fraction of who he actually was. He picked Emma up from school every day, and they ate dinner together, which they always did anyway. But now he was there when she got home and they did homework at the kitchen table, and she told him about the nitrogen atmosphere on Titan for the 3rd time, and he listened as carefully as the first. In the evenings, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and worked through calibration math in his notebook, because he couldn't stop. Because the problem lived in his head whether he wanted it to or not. He filed for the 2-week severance. He did not sign the termination agreement. On the 3rd evening, his phone buzzed with a news alert. He almost didn't open it. The headline was stark. Titan Automotive Prototype Fails at Investor Demo. Stock in Freefall. He sat at the kitchen table with Emma's homework paper still under his elbow and read the article. Then he closed his phone, sat very still, and looked at the T-Rex drawing still stuck to the refrigerator from lunchbox duty earlier that week. Roar means I love you. He thought about $18 million of engineering burning up in a demonstration hall, about the engineers who'd dismissed his report, about Victor Lang and the way he'd looked at Nolan like he was something mildly annoying. He thought about the calibration log, the date the setting had been changed. He opened his notebook to the pages he'd filled with his analysis and stared at them for a long time. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. It buzzed a 3rd time. Same number. He picked it up. Yeah. A pause. Then a woman's voice, clear, direct, no preamble. Mr. Pierce, this is Isabella Sterling. I'm the CEO of Titan Automotive. Another pause. Brief. Almost imperceptible. I think we need to talk. Nolan looked at the notebook open in front of him, at the math he'd done 3 days ago that nobody had wanted to hear. He leaned back in his chair. You have my attention, he said. Outside, the November wind moved through the street. Inside, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of Emma breathing through the monitor on the counter, steady and even, the way it sounded every night. The sound that had gotten him through harder things than this. Nolan Pierce held the phone against his ear and waited to hear what the most powerful person in the company had to say to the man they'd thrown away 3 days ago. Isabella Sterling did not make a habit of calling fired employees at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night. She was aware of how it looked. She was aware of a lot of things simultaneously. It was one of the less glamorous aspects of the job nobody put in the business profiles. While the magazine writers focused on the blazer and the boardroom confidence, the actual experience of being CEO was more like standing in the middle of a highway with traffic coming from every direction and being expected to not only avoid getting hit, but to direct the flow while you were at it. Tonight, the traffic was particularly bad. She was in her office on the 6th floor, not the glass-walled one the photographers liked, but the actual working office behind it, the one with the whiteboards covered in marker and the desk that had 3 different coffee cups on it in various states of being finished. Her jacket was on the back of her chair. She'd been there since 6 a.m., and it was now past 9 and the day had not improved since approximately 9:30 that morning, which was when everything had detonated. Her phone had not stopped. The board, the legal team, the PR department, who kept sending her draft statements that she kept rejecting because they were written in the voice of a company that didn't understand yet how serious this was. 2 investors who had been polite in the morning and significantly less polite by evening. A journalist from the automotive trade press who she'd sent to voicemail 4 times. And through all of it, one thing kept surfacing. One document pulled from the HR system by her chief of staff, Marcus Webb, who had placed it on her desk at around 4 in the afternoon with the careful expression of someone delivering something they'd rather not deliver. The termination file for Nolan Pierce. She'd read it twice. Then she'd asked Marcus to pull the internal reporting logs. The original report Pierce had submitted. The follow-up. The dismissal notice from Victor Lang's office, stamped and dated. She'd sat with those documents for a long time. "Find me a number for him," she'd told Marcus. Marcus had looked uncertain, which for Marcus was the equivalent of another person looking alarmed. "Isabella, legal is going to have some thoughts about—" "Marcus, find me the number." Now she sat with the phone to her ear, listening to it ring. And when the man picked up and said yeah in a voice that was flat with the specific flatness of someone who had been waiting for bad news all week and had mostly accepted it, she said her name and her title and told him they needed to talk. The pause that followed was only a second long, but she'd been in enough negotiations to know the weight of a short silence. "You have my attention," he said. She picked up a pen and put it down again. "First, I want to tell you that the report you submitted, both of them, I've read them. I read them tonight." "Little late," he said. "Yes." She didn't hedge it. "It is." Another pause. She could hear something in the background. Faint, distant. White noise, maybe, or a monitor. "My daughter's asleep," he said, and she understood then what the sound was. "So I can talk, but I'd like to understand something before we go any further." "Go ahead." "You're calling me personally, not legal, not HR, not some VP of operations. You." "That's right." "Why?" It was a direct question and she gave it a direct answer. "Because when I read your termination file tonight, I also read the report you submitted. And then I looked at the timing of certain things, and I have questions that I don't believe the people around me are going to answer honestly." The silence this time was longer. "What kind of questions?" "The calibration logs you cited in your report," she said. "I had Marcus pull the current state of those logs tonight. Some of them are different from what you attached." She heard him go very still. She could tell even over the phone. There was a quality to silence that changed when the person on the other end wasn't just pausing, but actually stopping. "Different how?" he said. "The entries you documented in your report," she said, "show a clear pattern. The current logs don't show that pattern. Several entries appear to have been modified." "When?" "Based on the system timestamps, sometime in the last 72 hours. Nolan Pierce was quiet again. She waited because she was good at waiting. "Someone altered the logs," he said, "after the demo failed." "That's what I'm looking at, yes." She heard him breathe. Not dramatically, just a person processing something. "They failed," he said. It wasn't gloating, it wasn't vindication exactly. It was more like the voice of someone who had been hoping to be wrong. "The engine shut down 11 minutes into the demonstration," Isabella said, "in front of 47 investors, 12 journalists, and 2 international partners. The damage to the test equipment alone is—" She stopped herself from going into numbers. "It was bad, Mr. Pierce. It was very bad." "I know," he said. I saw the headline. I need to understand what you found, not the summary version in the report. I need to understand it fully. I need to know whether someone made a mistake or whether someone made a choice. The question landed in the silence between them. Those are very different things, Nolan said carefully. I know they are. That's why I'm asking. Another pause. She heard him shift, the small sound of a chair adjusting. Your lead engineer on the Titan 12, he said. Lang's division. Who signs off on calibration changes? Department-level sign-off goes through Victor Lang himself for anything at the prototype stage. Then you already know it wasn't a mistake, Nolan said. Isabella set down her pen. I need more than a phone conversation. Can you come in tomorrow? To the building where I was publicly fired 3 days ago. It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it like one. I understand how that sounds. I don't think you do. He said it without heat, which somehow made it land harder. I had my daughter in the lobby, Ms. Sterling. There were people laughing. She had no good response to that. She knew it, and she sat with the discomfort of it instead of talking around it. No, you're right. I don't fully understand how that felt. A beat. I'm asking you to come in anyway, not for the company, because you were right, and because whatever happened to those logs, it's going to keep happening if nobody figures out what's actually going on. She heard him get up. The sound of a chair, footsteps, like he was moving to another room. Then quiet. 8 a.m., he said, not through the main entrance. I'll have Marcus meet you at the south door. And I want whatever's left of the original calibration logs preserved tonight. Don't let anyone touch them. Already done. Okay. A pause. Ms. Sterling. Yes. If I come in and I find out this conversation was a way to manage your legal exposure, if there's a document waiting for me to sign, there isn't. I'm going to finish the sentence, he said, calm and unhurried. If that's what this is, I'll walk back out. And everything I documented goes to the trade press and to whoever your investors' attorneys are, because I kept copies of everything. She didn't flinch. I would expect nothing less. A beat. 8 a.m., he said again, and hung up. Isabella sat in her quiet office for a moment. Then she picked up her desk phone and called Marcus. I need Victor Lang's full personnel file on my desk by 7 a.m. Everything. His original hire documentation, his credentials file, his project history, the whole thing. That's going to raise flags, Marcus said. Good, Isabella said. Let it raise flags. She didn't sleep much. That wasn't unusual. She'd never been a heavy sleeper, even as a kid, a quality her mother had found both impressive and exhausting. She was up at 4:30 at her kitchen counter with coffee and her laptop, going through 3 years of Victor Lang's project documentation with the particular focus that came from already suspecting what she was looking for. The thing about Victor Lang was that he was very good at being impressive. Impressive in the institutional sense, the kind of impressive that accumulated over decades through a mix of real competence and strategic positioning. He'd been at Titan for 9 years, longer than Isabella. When she'd taken the CEO role, he'd been one of the first to welcome her with the particular warmth of a man who had decided the new boss was manageable. She'd liked him initially. He was smooth and knowledgeable, and he had a way of walking through a technical problem in a meeting that made the room feel confident. He'd been a useful ally through her first year. Now, reading through his project history at 4:30 in the morning, she was looking at it differently. The Titan 12 had been Victor's flagship project. His name was on every major milestone document. He'd presented it to the board 6 times in 18 months. He'd personally managed the engineering team, controlled the approval process, oversaw every significant decision, including calibration sign-offs, including the one dated 4 weeks before the demo. She pulled up the documentation for Vance Systems, the R&D firm that had gone under 8 years ago, whose asset sale had included portions of a combustion optimization concept. Titan had acquired some of those assets through an intermediary. She'd known that vaguely, the way you know the history of a house you've moved into without having been there when it was built. Now she looked at the acquisition document specifically, the combustion optimization framework, the calibration architecture. The name in the original Vance Systems development documentation, buried in an attachment to a bankruptcy filing she had to cross-reference twice to find, was listed under primary contributors, N. Pierce. Isabella sat back. She drank her cold coffee. "Victor," she said quietly, to no one. Cut. Nolan showed up at the south entrance at 7:58, which Marcus noted with the expression of a man who appreciated punctuality. He was in a different shirt than the gray Titan one, a plain navy work shirt, no logo, and he was carrying his notebook. Marcus, who was 30 years old and had a master's degree and had worked for Isabella for 2 years, took one look at the notebook and the man carrying it and made a rapid, quiet reassessment of the situation. "Mr. Pierce, I'm Marcus Webb, Ms. Sterling's chief of staff. Thank you for coming in." "Sure." Nolan looked around the south entrance hallway. Service access, concrete floor, nowhere near the main lobby. "This works." "Ms. Sterling is waiting in the 4th floor conference room. Can I get you—" "Coffee would be good." "Of course." They rode the elevator in silence. Nolan watched the floors tick up. He'd been in this building for 3 years and only gone above the 2nd floor twice, both times for mandatory all-hands meetings in the large auditorium on 3. The 4th floor felt different up close, quieter, more deliberate, the kind of space that was designed to make people feel the weight of decisions made in it. The conference room was not the big glass one visible from the hallway. It was a smaller room, interior-facing, with a round table and a whiteboard that still had marker traces from something previous that had been imperfectly erased. Isabella Sterling was standing near the window, not sitting at the head of the table projecting authority, just standing there with a coffee cup and what looked like a file folder she'd been reviewing, and she turned when the door opened. She was shorter than he'd expected, though he couldn't have said why he'd expected anything. The magazine photo hadn't had a scale reference. She looked tired, functional tired, the kind that people in high-pressure jobs learn to operate through, but tired nonetheless. There were faint shadows under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it quickly rather than carefully. She looked at him across the table. He looked at her. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "thank you for coming." "You said not to expect a document to sign," he said. "I'm going to hold you to that." "No document." She gestured to the table. "Sit down, please." He sat. Marcus set coffee in front of him and left the room, closing the door behind him. Isabella put the file folder on the table but didn't open it. She sat across from him and looked at him with the direct, slightly uncomfortable focus of someone who was about to say something they'd been thinking about for hours. "I owe you an apology," she said. Nolan picked up his coffee. He didn't say it's fine or no worries or any of the reflexive social responses. He just waited. "What happened to you here was wrong," she said. "Your report was legitimate. It was accurate. And instead of being taken seriously, it was suppressed, and you were fired. That is not something I'm going to minimize with corporate language." "Okay," he said, "and I also need to tell you that I found something this morning that makes the situation significantly more complicated than I initially understood." He set his coffee down. "Tell me." She opened the file folder. She placed a document in front of him. The Vance Systems acquisition record. Then another. The original development documentation with his name on it. He looked at them for a long moment. His jaw tightened slightly, just slightly. "You knew," she said. It wasn't an accusation. She genuinely wasn't sure. "I knew the architecture was familiar," he said. His voice was even. "I didn't have documentation. I didn't have anything a lawyer would care about. I had my own memory of work I'd done 8 years ago, and I needed the job." He looked at her. "I'm not proud of that decision. I made it anyway." She nodded. Victor Lang was the person who managed the acquisition of Vance Systems' assets. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, more like a piece of something clicking into place that had been sitting at a wrong angle for a long time. He was already at Titan when the acquisition happened. Yes, he oversaw it personally. She paused. And his name doesn't appear anywhere in the original Vance documentation. But the architecture that became the foundation of the Titan 12 was mine, Nolan said. Flat, certain. The calibration framework, the synchronization logic, I wrote that. "I believe you." She held his gaze. I also believe that Victor altered the calibration setting not by accident, but to cover something. A weakness in a design decision he made when he developed the Titan 12 framework. A decision that deviated from your original architecture in a way that created a structural flaw. She paused. When you found the variance in the logs, you weren't just finding an operational problem. You were finding evidence that would point directly to a design flaw that would, under examination, raise questions about where the design came from. Nolan was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the gray November sky above the parking structure, and then he looked back at her. He buried my warning to protect himself. Yes. And then the engine failed anyway. Yes. And now the logs have been altered. Yes. He sat back. He put one hand flat on the table, not tensely, just resting there, a grounded gesture. What do you want from me, Ms. Sterling? She didn't dress it up. I want to know if you can fix it, the engine, the specific failure. I have 30 engineers who have been working on it for 3 days, and none of them know what they're looking at because the documentation they have is incomplete. She paused. You know what they're looking at. He was quiet. The investors are threatening litigation, she said. 2 international partners have issued formal notices of concern. The stock has dropped 11 points. I have a board meeting in 6 days, and right now the best answer I have for them is, we don't know what happened yet. She didn't say it desperately. She said it the way people state facts about bad situations, plainly, without inflation. You're the only person I've spoken to who actually knows this engine. I haven't touched the prototype, he said. Not the actual engine. But the architecture? I know the architecture, he said. I know it the way you know something you built. He looked at his notebook, then back at her. If the alteration is what I documented in my report, it's a specific calibration setting in the synchronization layer. Reversing it isn't complicated. The problem is that reversing it will expose the underlying design record. What was changed? When? By whom? I know, she said. Victor Lang is your senior VP. Not for much longer. He studied her face. She met his eyes and didn't look away. He was, she noticed, not an easy person to read. Not guarded exactly, but contained. Someone who had learned to think before reacting and had gotten very good at it. I'm not walking back in here to be managed, he said. I'm not signing something. I'm not doing a quiet fix in a back room that lets this get buried. If I come in and look at that engine and confirm what I found, it goes on the record, all of it. The original reports, the log alterations, the design history, everything. Agreed, she said. That's a significant commitment for you to make without your legal team in the room. My legal team, she said carefully, has been managing Victor Lang's exposure for the past 3 days without fully realizing it. I need to get ahead of this, not behind it. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense that he was measuring something, not her authority, not her position. Something else. Whether she meant what she said. My daughter, he said, Emma. She has a field trip Friday. I have to be done in time to pick her up. Isabella blinked. It was so practical, so unadorned that it took her a half-second to process it. Of course. I want access to the full calibration log history, not the altered current version, the archived system backups. Your IT team should have them. I'll have Marcus arrange it. And I want to work alone in the test bay. I don't need a team standing over my shoulder. Done. He nodded once. He picked up his coffee again and drank the rest of it. Then he opened his notebook to a page covered in diagrams. The same ones he'd been working on in his apartment, she realized, for 3 days, alone at his kitchen table with his fired status and his daughter's homework and his copy of a report nobody had wanted to read. He turned the notebook to face her. The math was dense and precise and covered the page in the methodical, layered way of someone who thinks through problems completely before they speak about them. The failure, he said, pointing to a specific section of the diagram. It starts here. She leaned forward. The November light came through the window at a low angle, catching the edge of the table, the paper, the pen marks. Outside, somewhere in the building, the day was grinding on. Engineers in rooms they didn't fully understand, executives drafting statements, investors watching their portfolios. In this small interior conference room, with a whiteboard that had been imperfectly erased and 2 cups of going cold coffee, The man the company had thrown away 3 days ago began explaining exactly what had gone wrong. Isabella Sterling listened carefully, and for the first time since 9:30 yesterday morning, she felt like she was finally getting real information. Marcus had the archived system backups ready by 10 a.m. It took him 40 minutes and 2 phone calls to the IT department, during which he apparently had to explain twice that the request was coming from Isabella directly and was not optional. When he finally walked into the conference room with a laptop already logged into the archive system, he set it in front of Nolan without comment, which Nolan appreciated. Isabella had stepped out briefly to handle something. A call from the board, from the sound of the half-sentence Nolan caught before the door closed. He could hear her in the hallway, her voice controlled and precise, the voice of someone managing a situation that kept expanding in every direction. He didn't envy her that. He opened the archive system and found the calibration logs for the Titan 12. The backup server stored system states at 48-hour intervals, standard IT protocol for large engineering databases, the kind of policy that exists because someone once lost 3 months of work and never stopped being angry about it. What this meant practically was that there were snapshots of the log data going back 14 months, untouched by whatever had been done to the live system in the past 72 hours. Nolan worked through them methodically. He pulled the backup from 6 weeks ago, then 5 weeks, then 4. He cross-referenced them against the documentation he'd photographed from his own notebook before leaving the building the day he was fired, a habit born from years of being the kind of person who keeps records because he's learned that records matter. The alteration was exactly where he'd told Isabella it would be. 4 weeks and 3 days before the failed demonstration, a calibration entry in the synchronization layer had been modified. The original setting, the one that matched the baseline architecture Nolan had developed at Advanced Systems, had been replaced with a value that looked reasonable in isolation but created a specific thermal stress condition under sustained high-output operation. Not a dramatic change, subtle enough to pass a routine review, catastrophic enough under the right conditions to bring everything down. He sat with the data for a while, checking and rechecking, because he didn't want to be wrong and he didn't want to be right for the wrong reasons. He traced the change through every subsequent log entry, watching the cascade effect build across 4 weeks of test data that nobody had been reading the way he was reading it. Then he looked at the user ID attached to the modification entry. He looked at it for a long moment. When Isabella came back into the room, she closed the door and looked at his face. "You found it," she said. "I found it." He turned the laptop to face her. The modification was made under user ID VL-0041. You can check your employee system. She looked at the screen. Then she sat down slowly in the chair across from him, and for a moment she didn't say anything. She just looked at the entry, the date, the user ID, the modified value, with the expression of someone who had suspected something and still felt the weight of it confirmed. "Victor Lang," she said, "his credentials. Whether he made the change personally or had someone do it, I can't tell you, but the login is his." Isabella was quiet. She had a specific quality when she was processing something difficult. Not stillness exactly, more a kind of concentrated tension, like a structure under load that hasn't broken yet. "The original reports you submitted," she said. "They were dismissed through his office." "Yes." "He saw what you'd found. He knew you'd identified the alteration. And he needed me gone before I pushed it far enough that someone above him looked at the logs themselves." Nolan closed the laptop. "The termination wasn't about my conduct. It was about what I knew." She stood up and walked to the whiteboard. She picked up a marker and then set it back down without writing anything, a gesture that looked like nervous energy being redirected. "He's been here 9 years, she said, not to Nolan specifically, more out loud to herself. "He built a reputation. He ran this division. People respect him." "People respected him," Nolan said. "Past tense might be appropriate now." She looked at him. "You don't seem angry." He thought about that. "I'm not angry," he said carefully. "I just don't find it useful right now." He paused. "My wife used to say, I processed things slow and felt them late. She wasn't wrong." It was the first time he'd mentioned Claire to anyone at Titan, to anyone outside his small immediate circle in longer than he could easily remember. He wasn't sure why he'd said it. Maybe because the conversation had reached a kind of altitude where small social filters weren't doing much work. Isabella didn't turn it into a moment. "What do you need to look at the engine itself?" she said. "Access to the test bay. The full engineering spec file. The actual one, not the public-facing version. And time." "How much time?" "Depends on what I find when I'm in there." He picked up his notebook. "A few hours, maybe. If the calibration alteration is the only issue, it's a straightforward correction. If you made other modifications I haven't found yet, it could be longer." "I'll take you down now if you're ready." The test bay was on sub-level 3, one floor below where Nolan had worked for 3 years. In a section of the facility he'd never had authorization to enter. It was a large, high-ceilinged space with fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly clinical, and it smelled like machine oil and something faintly burned. The residue of whatever had happened to the equipment during the failed demonstration, still hanging in the air even though the damaged components had been replaced. The Titan 12 sat at the center of the bay on a reinforced test platform. It was larger than it looked in the company's promotional material. The promotional material always photographed it from an angle that made it look sleek and contained, a piece of art as much as an engine. Up close, it looked like what it was. An enormously complex mechanical system that someone had spent 18 months building and that had failed very publicly 3 days ago. Nolan stood in front of it for a moment. Isabella stood a few feet back, watching him. She'd arranged for the bay to be cleared. The 2 junior engineers who'd been assigned overnight monitoring had been sent upstairs with instructions not to return until she called. It was just the 2 of them in the space, and the engine, and the low hum of the building's ventilation. He walked around it slowly. Not touching it yet, just looking, reading it the way you read something written in a language you grew up with. "The damage from the shutdown," he said. "Where did it manifest?" "The thermal coupling on the secondary modulation array," Isabella said. She'd done her homework, so she'd been up at 4:30 reading documentation, and she'd kept reading since. "And the interface between the synchronization layer and the output drive system. The engineers thought it was a hardware failure." "It wasn't," he said. "The hardware failed because the calibration error created a thermal load the coupling wasn't rated for." He crouched down beside the lower section of the engine, looking at the configuration of the synchronization components. The components did exactly what they were designed to do. They just weren't designed for what the modified setting was asking them to handle. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and started sketching. Not nervously, with the focused calm of someone doing something they're genuinely good at, without an audience in their head. Isabella leaned against the workbench behind him and watched. She was aware that she was watching, and aware that it said something about the situation that the person in the test bay who looked most like he belonged there was the one she'd had fired 6 days ago. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "When you first got here, to Titan, 3 years ago, when you walked into this facility and recognized the architecture," she paused. "You stayed anyway. You didn't say anything to anyone. Why?" He didn't answer immediately. He kept sketching, filling in the diagram with the careful precision that was apparently just how he moved through things. "I had a 6-month-old medical debt from when Emma had her appendix out," he said finally. "And a lease I'd just signed, and I was 32 and trying to keep it together." He glanced up briefly. "You want the honest answer or the one that makes me sound principled?" "The honest one." "The honest one is that I was tired," he said. "I'd spent a year after Vance Systems went under trying to figure out what happened to the work, and I never got far enough to do anything about it, and I had a daughter and a pile of bills, and I needed the job." He looked back at the engine. "So I took the job, and I did the work, and I told myself it wasn't my problem." "But you kept the notebooks." He paused. A small pause. Just a beat. "Yeah, I kept the notebooks." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "She went to a doctor 3 times a year because she was premature," he said. "It came out quieter, the way things do when they don't have a clean segue and you say them anyway. Emma, she was early by 6 weeks. Claire was, my wife was. She was fine through the pregnancy. Nothing indicated any issues. And then complications in the delivery that nobody predicted." He was still sketching. His hand hadn't stopped. "Emma was fine. She's been fine. She's healthy and frankly kind of terrifying in her confidence for a 6-year-old. But for the first 2 years, every doctor visit was, You're just waiting. You're just holding your breath. He looked up again, and this time he met her eyes briefly before looking back at the diagram. So I took the stable job, and I didn't make waves, because I had something I couldn't afford to lose. Isabella looked at him. She thought about her own 2 years in this role, the decisions she'd made for institutional reasons, the things she'd overlooked because the politics were complicated, the moments she'd trusted the people around her more than she should have because it was easier than being the person who asked the hard questions. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your wife." "It was 4 years ago," he said, not dismissively, just accurately. "That doesn't mean anything." He considered that. "No," he said, "I guess it doesn't." He stood up, rolled his shoulders once, a gesture of someone who'd been crouching long enough to feel it, and moved to the access panel on the synchronization module. "I need a torque driver, 3mm hex. There should be one on the wall rack." She found it and handed it to him without comment. He worked for 2 hours. Isabella stayed. She told Marcus she'd be unavailable until further notice, a message that she knew was generating concern in several different directions and didn't particularly care about. She answered 2 texts from the board chair, brief, professional, holding the line on details until she had something concrete. And she watched Nolan Pierce work. He wasn't dramatic about it. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He opened panels, ran diagnostics from a handheld reader he'd apparently brought in his bag, cross-referenced readings against the diagrams in his notebook, made small adjustments, checked again. He talked to himself occasionally, not narration, just murmuring numbers and observations in a way that seemed unconscious, the verbal equivalent of the diagrams he kept drawing. At one point he stopped and was still for about 30 seconds, looking at something on the reader, and she felt the room tension shift. She straightened. "What?" she said. "There's a second modification," he said. She crossed to where he was standing. He showed her the reader display, a string of diagnostic data that she could follow well enough to understand that it was not in the range it should be. "He didn't just alter the calibration setting," Nolan said. His voice was level. "He also modified the thermal threshold protocol, the safety limit that would normally trigger an automatic shutdown before damage occurred." He looked at her. He raised it. "Meaning the automatic shutdown didn't prevent the damage," she said slowly. "It came too late. He adjusted the safety threshold so the engine would push past the failure point before shutting down. Instead of a clean stop, you get a cascade." He looked at the engine. He didn't just hide a flaw. He removed the safeguard that would have contained it. The word sabotage was in the room between them, unspoken. Isabella heard it anyway. "He knew," she said. "He knew what was going to happen." "He knew exactly what was going to happen," Nolan said. "I've been trying to think of an explanation that isn't that, and I don't have one." She turned away from the engine and stood with her back to it, arms crossed, not from cold or defensiveness, but the posture of someone holding their own weight up while they think. "Why would he do that?" she said. "If his name is on this project, if it fails, he fails with it." "Not necessarily," Nolan said. "Not if the failure gets attributed to someone else, or to a manufacturing defect, or to sabotage by a disgruntled fired employee who'd been accessing files he wasn't authorized to access." He paused. "There was already language in my termination about unauthorized file access." She turned back to face him. "He was setting me up," Nolan said. It was the first time he'd said it plainly, and he said it plainly. No drama, just the flat clarity of a piece of logic completing itself. The termination created a paper trail. Employee dismissed for conduct issues had been accessing engineering files outside his clearance. Demo fails shortly after. There's your story. Isabella's jaw tightened. She had a very controlled face most of the time, but the jaw was telling. He was going to let you take it. He was going to try. Nolan looked at the handheld reader again. The problem is the logs don't actually support it. The access entries from my credentials are all diagnostic reads. No modifications. Any engineer who looked at the actual data would see that, but most people wouldn't look. They'd take the narrative. He set the reader down. He needed me gone quickly, and he needed the story ready. The problem he didn't anticipate is that you called me. She was quiet for a moment. "When Marcus first put your file on my desk," she said, I almost didn't look at it. I had 40 other things. I almost handed it to legal and moved on. What changed? It was quiet for a beat. The date on your follow-up report, she said. You submitted it the day before the demo. Who submits a follow-up report the day before a major demo? Someone who is genuinely trying to cause problems. They don't do that. They do it a week earlier, when it can still be used as disruption. Someone who actually believes there's a problem. They do it the day before because they're hoping someone will listen at the last minute. She met his eyes. It read like someone who was trying to prevent something, not someone trying to create something. He looked at her for a moment. You read people pretty well. I've had to, she said. This job requires it. Mine too, he said. Different scale. She almost smiled. Almost. He turned back to the engine. Give me another 40 minutes. I want to document the second modification formally before I correct it. If this is going to be a legal matter, and it is, you need the record of exactly what was done and where. Agreed. She pulled out her phone. I'm going to call Marcus and have him start pulling Victor's access logs for the past 6 months. All of them. You'll also want the original Vance Systems acquisition documentation. Not just the summary, the full technical transfer records. Whatever engineering materials were included in the asset sale. Already started on that this morning. He glanced at her sideways. You were up early. 4:30, she said. So was I. He picked up his torque driver. Emma had a nightmare. She ended up in my bed at 2 a.m. and then by 4:30 I couldn't get back to sleep and I just started working. What was the nightmare about? Dinosaurs, he said. Specifically a T-Rex that was, and I quote, being rude. Isabella looked at him. He said it completely straight, focused on the access panel, and she pressed her lips together for a second. She sounds like a lot. She's everything, he said simply, and went back to work. Marcus's call came in at 12:47. Isabella stepped toward the far end of the bay to take it, far enough for privacy but close enough that Nolan could hear her tone shift from managed professional to something sharper and more alert. When? She said. Then, how long has he been in there? And then, after a pause, don't let him leave. I'll be up in 10 minutes. She came back toward the workbench. Victor is in the building, she said. He came in through the executive entrance 20 minutes ago. He went directly to the engineering documentation archive on 5. Nolan looked up from the engine. The archive that has the original design records? Yes. If he gets to those files, he's already in, she said. Marcus has someone on the floor, but we can't lock him out without flagging the whole system. She looked at Nolan. How much longer do you need here? The second modification is documented. The correction itself takes 10 minutes once I start. He closed his notebook. Go, deal with him. I'll finish. I don't want to leave you, Ms. Sterling. He met her eyes. His voice was calm but direct. I've been looking at this engine for 2 hours. I'm not going anywhere. Go stop him from destroying evidence. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she turned and walked fast toward the exit, her heels sharp on the concrete floor, and the bay door swung shut behind her. Nolan stood alone in the test bay with the engine and the low hum of the building and his notebook full of diagrams. He picked up the torque driver. He had work to do. Then, the elevator opened onto the 5th floor to find Marcus standing near the archive room door with the tightly controlled expression of a man who has been told not to do anything and is finding that extremely difficult. He nodded at Isabella as she came off the elevator, a small, urgent nod. He's been in there for 15 minutes, Marcus said low. He hasn't come out. Is anyone with him? He came alone. She put her hand on the archive room door, pushed it open. Victor Lang was at the far terminal, standing, not sitting, the posture of a man who'd come in to do something specific and fast. He had a USB drive in the terminal port. On the screen behind him, a file transfer progress bar was 3/4 complete. He turned when the door opened, and in the half-second before he composed himself, Isabella saw exactly what she needed to see. The flash of a man who had been caught mid-action and knew it. Isabella, he said. The warmth in his voice was practiced and immediate, the professional warmth she'd once found reassuring. I heard about the situation downstairs. I wanted to pull the original spec files so we can get the engineering team back on track. Stop the transfer, she said. He kept his expression even. I don't think... Victor. Her voice was quiet, not loud. The kind of quiet that carries more weight than raised voices. Stop the transfer and remove the drive. He looked at her for a moment, a measuring look. The look of a man calculating whether there's still a play available. Then he looked at the progress bar, which had just hit 100%, and he smiled, not warmly. The professional warmth was entirely gone. It's already done, he said. She crossed the room in 6 steps and pulled the USB drive from the terminal herself. He didn't move to stop her. He just stood there with the expression of a man who had decided in real time to switch strategies entirely. Whatever Nolan Pierce told you, he said, I'd think carefully about how much credibility you're giving a fired maintenance technician with a grievance. He didn't tell me anything I didn't verify independently. She held the drive. I've seen the access logs, Victor. I've seen the calibration records. I've seen the Advanced Systems Acquisition documentation. She looked at him directly. I've seen whose user credentials are attached to every modification in that engine. Something shifted in his face. The calculation was complete. He'd made his play and it hadn't worked, and now he was deciding what came next. This company would not exist in its current form without the work I've done, he said. His voice was still controlled, but the warmth was fully gone now, and what was underneath it was harder and colder. 18 months on that engine. 18 months I spent building something this company was going to put its name on and call a breakthrough. You want to talk about whose work it was? I built that program. On an architecture you didn't create, Isabella said. He shook his head slowly. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I have a pretty good idea, she said. And so will the legal team. She took a step back toward the door. Marcus is going to escort you to the HR suite. Your access credentials have been suspended as of... She glanced at her phone. 4 minutes ago. Building security has been notified. He stood very still for a moment. The controlled surfaces had all dropped now, and what remained was just a man who had spent 9 years building a position and was watching it come apart in real time. He looked at her the way people look at things they've lost. Not with grief, but with a specific, ugly anger. That man is a technician, he said. Whatever he told you. He told me the truth, she said, which is more than you've done. She walked out of the archive room, leaving Marcus to handle the rest of it. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was not quite, but that was the kind of thing you managed. In the elevator going back down to sub-level 3, she held the USB drive and let herself breathe for a moment. When she pushed open the door to the test bay, Nolan was standing beside the engine with the torque driver in his hand and the handheld diagnostic reader in the other. He looked up when she came in. How'd it go? He said. He got the files, she said. I got the drive. He looked at her. And? He'll be formally suspended within the hour. She set the drive on the workbench. IT is already pulling a mirror of everything he accessed. She looked at the engine. Are you finished? Almost. He looked at the diagnostic reader. The calibration is corrected. I need to run one more check on the thermal threshold. I want to confirm the safety protocol is fully restored. He paused. Then I think you can start the engine. She looked at the Titan 12. Massive, complicated, expensive, broken, and now, possibly, not broken. Let's find out, she said. The diagnostic reader showed green across every parameter. Nolan stood back, looked at the display one more time. The way you look at a calculation, you've already checked twice because the stakes are high enough that twice doesn't feel like enough, and then he set it down on the workbench. Thermal threshold is restored to baseline, he said. Calibration is corrected. Safety protocols are functioning. He picked up his notebook and made a final notation. The time, the readings, the exact values he'd restored, because that was how he did things. Paper record alongside digital, always. You can start it. Isabella was already at the operator console on the far wall, the one the engineering team used to initiate and monitor test sequences. She'd pulled up the startup protocol without being told where to find it, which told him something about how closely she'd been watching her own operation in the past week. I should call someone down to observe, she said, her hand hovering over the initialization panel. Technically, a test sequence requires... You want to wait another 2 hours while you get people in here? She looked at the engine, then at him. No, she admitted. Then start it. She initiated the sequence. The Titan 12 came to life the way large engines do. Not all at once, but in stages. Systems waking up in sequence, the sound building from low vibration to something deeper and more authoritative. The floor carried the resonance of it up through the soles of Nolan's boots, the specific physical sensation of a system operating under load, and he stood there with his arms at his sides and watched the diagnostic displays on the console climb through their ranges, every reading within parameters, every system nominal. The engine ran. Not for a minute, for 6 full minutes. Nolan standing at the console, watching the numbers while Isabella stood beside him, and neither of them said anything. 6 minutes, which was the duration of the standard confirmation run, the protocol he'd found in the engineering spec file that morning. Long enough to be sure. At the end of 6 minutes, he reached over and hit the shutdown sequence. The engine wound down. The room went quiet. Isabella let out a breath that she had clearly been holding for at least part of those 6 minutes. She didn't make a production of it, just a controlled exhalation, the kind that happens when tension releases and you don't entirely have control of the moment. 3 days, she said, 30 engineers, consultants from 2 firms. She looked at the engine. You've been here 5 hours. I had context they didn't have, he said. He wasn't being modest about it, and he wasn't being arrogant about it, just accurate. They were looking at a machine. I was looking at something I helped design. There's a difference. Significant difference. She turned from the console and faced him fully. Nolan. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He noticed, and from the slight pause she took immediately after, she noticed too. I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, it won't affect anything we've already agreed on regarding the record correction and the documentation. He looked at her. Okay. Do you want to come back? He was quiet for a moment. To what position? That's the wrong question, she said. And you know it's the wrong question. He picked up his notebook from the workbench, turned it in his hands once. The position I was fired from, he said, was senior maintenance technician, which was not the right title for what I was actually doing here. No, she agreed. It was not. And whoever set up that arrangement, whoever decided that a man whose work was foundational to this engine was going to be hired as a maintenance tech, that was either a very stupid decision or a very intentional one. She didn't flinch from it. I don't know yet which it was. That's part of what I'm going to find out. She met his eyes. But I know what the right arrangement looks like going forward, if you want it. He stood in the quiet test bay with the smell of machine oil and the faint burned residue of a failure that had already been corrected. And he thought about the notebook in his hands, and the 11 others like it at home, and the specific feeling of being in a room with a system he understood at a level nobody else in the building did. I want to get Emma from school, he said. She has a field trip and she'll want to tell me about it. Isabella looked at him for a second. Then she said, it's 12:40. You have 2.5 hours. I know. He tucked the notebook under his arm. We can talk about the rest of it after that. She nodded. I'll have Marcus send a car. I don't need us. I'll have Marcus send a car. He looked at her. She was not backing down from it, and he was tired enough, and the offer had that particular quality of being from someone who understood that the gesture mattered even when the person receiving it would rather decline it. Okay, he said. Marcus met him near the south entrance with a visitor badge and an expression that had shifted slightly from the careful professional neutrality of the morning. Something in the day had moved him, though Marcus would have denied it if asked. Ms. Sterling asked me to give you this, Marcus said, holding out a document. It's a formal record of the investigation findings as of this morning. She wanted you to have a copy. Nolan took it, scanned the first page, his name, his original report numbers, the timeline, the findings. His termination listed as without cause to be corrected. Tell her I'll read it tonight, he said. She also said, Marcus hesitated, this is off the official script. She said to tell you that Emma's field trip sounds important and you shouldn't be late. Nolan looked at him. Marcus had the expression of a man delivering a message he found slightly sentimental and was choosing to commit to anyway. "Tell her I won't be," Nolan said. He stepped out the south door into the November afternoon. The sky had cleared since morning. Not warm, but clear. The kind of sharp November light that makes everything look more defined than usual. He stood on the sidewalk for a second before the town car Marcus had arranged pulled up. He got in. The driver didn't try to make conversation, which was its own small mercy, and Nolan sat in the back with the document in his lap and the notebook beside him and watched Garrett City move past the window. He thought about Emma on the field trip. She'd gone to the Natural History Museum with her class, dinosaurs specifically. She'd been so excited she'd talked about it through dinner the night before and at breakfast that morning, rattling off genus names with the same focused energy she brought to everything she decided mattered. He thought about the T-Rex on the Post-it note in her lunchbox and whether she'd shown it to her teacher. He thought about Claire, who would have been on the parent volunteer list for that field trip, who would have packed Emma's lunch and made it better than his, and who would have been the one Emma ran to first when she came off the bus with something she needed to tell someone right away. He thought about that for a few blocks without trying to stop thinking about it, which was the only thing that actually helped. Not avoiding it, but letting it move through him, the way you let weather pass. He opened the document in his lap and read. The board meeting happened the following morning. Isabella had spent the evening preparing for it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the next 90 minutes would determine not just the immediate crisis response, but the long-term shape of what the company was going to be on the other side of this. She and Marcus had worked until after midnight, going through the documentation, organizing the timeline, preparing for the questions she knew were coming and the ones she couldn't predict. Marcus had gone home at 11:30, and she'd stayed another hour alone in her office, going through the calibration documentation one more time, not because she needed to check it again, but because she wanted to know it cold. She wanted to be in that room the next morning without notes, without hedging, with absolute command of every detail. She was there at 7. The board members arrived between 7:30 and 8. There were 9 of them, 6 men and 3 women, ranging in age from 46 to 71, representing a combined century and a half of business experience and a combined net worth that Isabella generally tried not to think about during contentious conversations. The board chair, a measured and difficult man named Howard Pratt, who had the eyes of someone who had sat in rooms like this for 40 years and had stopped being impressed by anything, looked at her as she took her seat at the head of the table and said, "Walk us through it." She did. 45 minutes, no notes. The original failure, the dismissed reports, the falsified logs, the Vance Systems connection, Victor Lang's access records, the calibration alterations, the second modification to the safety threshold, the archive room incident, and the successful test run the previous afternoon. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms full of powerful people go quiet when they're hearing something they hadn't expected to hear and are working out what it means for them. "The engine is operational," she said. "As of yesterday at 12:18 p.m., the damage to the test equipment has been assessed and is repairable within the current budget. We have documentation of the full chain of events preserved in backup systems that were not affected by the log alteration." She paused. "Victor Lang has been formally suspended pending investigation. Our legal team is in contact with outside counsel regarding the scope of the fraud and intellectual property issues. I expect we'll have a formal recommendation on charges within 2 weeks." Howard Pratt leaned forward slightly. "The technician," he said. "Pierce." "Nolan Pierce," she said, "who is not a technician. He's listed in the personnel file as senior maintenance technician." "He shouldn't have been," she said. "He has a mechanical engineering degree and 8 years of specialized experience, including the development of the calibration architecture that became foundational to the Titan 12. She kept her voice level. "He was hired into a role below his qualifications, which I'm still investigating the circumstances of, and he was terminated in retaliation for accurately reporting a critical flaw that the company failed to address." She looked at the board. "I intend to correct both of those things." A board member named Patricia Nguyen, who was 62 and had a background in operations, and the particular directness of someone who had been in enough meetings to have stopped caring about softening things, said, "How do we manage the public dimension of this? The demo failure is already a story. When the fraud piece comes out, We get ahead of it, Isabella said. We don't manage it. We don't spin it. We don't release a statement that sounds like a company protecting itself. We tell the full story. The flaw was identified by one of our own people. The warning was suppressed by a senior executive acting in his own interest, and the company is correcting both the technical and the institutional failure. She paused. The story of a company that discovers corruption and addresses it is better than the story of a company that had a catastrophic public failure and can't explain why. That's a significant bet, Pratt said. It's not a bet. It's the truth. And in my experience, the truth is easier to sustain than the alternative. The room was quiet again. Pratt looked at her for a moment with those 40 years of boardroom's eyes, doing the calculation. The engine runs, he said. The engine runs, she confirmed. He nodded slowly. Then let's talk about what happens next. Victor Lang's formal suspension had already generated what Marcus described as significant internal noise, which was a precise understatement. By the time Isabella got back to her office after the board meeting, her inbox had 47 unread messages, which was not unusual, and the hallways had the particular low-current tension that moves through an organization when something people had thought was stable turns out not to be. She was aware that some people, particularly those who had worked closely with Victor, people who had benefited from his patronage or simply liked him as a colleague, were going to push back on what was happening. That was unavoidable. It was the cost of doing this correctly instead of quietly. She dealt with her inbox, handled 2 calls, and then cleared her afternoon. She had one more conversation she needed to have before the day was done. Check. Nolan had picked up Emma at 2:45. The field trip bus had been 20 minutes late, which meant he stood outside the school in the November air with 3 other parents and a teacher who kept checking her watch, and he spent the time reading through the document Marcus had given him in the car. Emma came off the bus in a state of barely contained excitement, which was her standard mode after experiences she found genuinely significant. She launched into an account of the T-Rex exhibit before she was fully off the bus steps, her backpack bouncing, her hands moving in the descriptive way she used when words alone weren't quite enough. He walked home with her, listening. He asked questions, real ones, not the conversational maintenance kind. She told him about the skeleton reconstruction and the signage explaining the nitrogen cycle in prehistoric ecosystems, which she'd read herself and had questions about that the teachers couldn't fully answer, and which she planned to look up when she got home. You know what's weird? She said as they turned onto their block. A lot of things. Specifically, the museum had a thing about how scientists used to think T-Rex was a slow predator, and now they think it was actually really fast, and everyone just changed their mind because of new evidence. He looked at her. Yeah? That's how science is supposed to work, she said, with the tone of someone who had recently learned this and was still feeling the significance of it. You find new information and you update. He thought about that for half a block. People have a harder time with it than scientists are supposed to, he said. I know, Emma said. I've noticed. He looked down at her. 6 years old and she'd noticed. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or be slightly unsettled by how clearly she saw things. They had dinner, pasta, the simple kind, because he hadn't had time to think about anything more involved. Emma did homework at the table while he cleaned up, and he told her carefully, matter-of-factly, that he'd gone back to the company today and helped fix something. She didn't look up from her worksheet. The engine thing? Yeah. Did it work? Yeah, it worked. She made a sound that was essentially obviously without quite saying it, which was a mannerism she had absolutely gotten from Claire, and which still, 4 years later, hit him in the chest just slightly. Are you going back to work there? She asked. I might. The same job as before? No, he said. Different. She looked up from the worksheet. She had Claire's eyes, Mats, dark and direct and not willing to accept incomplete information. Better or worse? Better, he said. She looked at him for a moment in that assessing way she had. Then she went back to her worksheet. Okay, she said. His phone rang at 7:15 Isabella. He answered in the kitchen, Emma visible through the doorway, working on the homework he'd already confirmed was done correctly. How was the field trip? Isabella said. He paused. Not because it was a strange question, but because it took him a half second to recalibrate to a version of the conversation where that was a thing she would ask. Informative, he said. Apparently T-Rex was faster than previously believed. I'll file that away. A brief pause. Board meeting this morning went well. They're aligned on the path forward. Legal is moving on, Victor. Good. I want to send you the formal offer tomorrow. Chief Systems Engineer. It's a new role. I'm creating it as part of a restructure of the engineering division. It comes with full design authority on the Titan 12 project going forward, and oversight responsibility for the calibration and validation process across all prototype work. She paused. The hours are flexible. Marcus is already drafting language around schedule accommodation for family obligations. He leaned against the counter. That last part was your idea or Marcus's? Mine, she said. Marcus would have included it anyway, but it was mine. He was quiet for a moment. Through the doorway, Emma was erasing something on her worksheet and frowning at it with focused displeasure. There's something else, Isabella said. Her voice shifted slightly. Still professional, but with a different quality underneath it. The quality of saying something that isn't strictly part of the business agenda. The Vance Systems documentation. The original development records that show your contribution to the calibration architecture. I'm having our IP legal team review the acquisition records from 8 years ago. Whatever was done with that work, whoever profited from it in ways they shouldn't have, I want it addressed. He was quiet for longer this time. That's a complicated process, he said. 8 years of paper. I know. It might not go anywhere. It might not, she said. I think it should be tried anyway. A pause. You built something. The fact that it ended up somewhere without your name on it isn't something I can fully fix, but I can make sure Titan's record is accurate going forward, and I can make sure whoever else needs to hear about the Vance acquisition does. He looked at the ceiling of his kitchen. The fluorescent light he'd been meaning to replace for 6 months, still flickering slightly at the edges. I'll read the offer, he said. That's all I'm asking. And I want to bring my own notebooks into the role, my analysis records from the past 3 years. Of course. And I want direct access to the testing division. No routing everything through an intermediate VP. Done. And I want my name on the technical documentation going forward, every document I contribute to. I'll put it in writing myself, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Isabella? It was the first time he'd used her first name, and he said it the same way she'd said his. Not quite accidentally, but not entirely premeditated either. Yes? The people who were in the lobby when I was walked out, he said. Some of them laughed. I know. I'm not asking for an apology from them. I'm saying that walking back in there is not a small thing for me. I need you to understand that before we go any further with this. She was quiet for a moment. I understand, she said, and I want you to know that when you come back, it won't be through the maintenance entrance. A pause. It won't be through the south door either. What does that mean? It means I'm going to make sure the circumstances of your return are on the record, she said, not as a performance, because it's accurate, and accuracy matters. He thought about that. He looked at Emma through the doorway, who had apparently resolved her worksheet issue and was now drawing something in the margin because she always drew in the margin when she was waiting for the next task. He thought about what his life had looked like 6 days ago and what it looked like now, and the specific unreliable quality of circumstances, how fast they shifted, how little warning they gave, how much of what happened to a person had nothing to do with whether they'd done things right. He thought about Claire, who had told him once, during the hard months after Vance Systems, when he'd been frustrated and stuck and grinding through days that felt like they weren't adding up to anything, she'd told him that the work was worth doing regardless of whether anyone was watching. You'll know, she'd said. That's enough for now. He hadn't entirely believed her at the time. Send me the offer, he said. I'll have Marcus send it tonight, Isabella said. Get some rest. You too, he said. He almost left it there, and then he added, You did good today. The board meeting, the archive room, all of it. That wasn't easy. A pause on her end. Brief. It wasn't, she said. Thank you for saying so. He hung up. He He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the particular quiet of an apartment at night when things have shifted and the air hasn't quite caught up to the shift yet. "Daddy," Emma called from the other room, "I drew a better T-Rex than yours." He pushed off the counter and went through the doorway to look. She had. She absolutely had. Hers had proper proportions and a genuinely menacing expression, and she'd labeled it in careful printing, "Actually fast, new evidence." He stood there looking at it for a second, and something in his chest did a thing he hadn't braced for. Not grief and not quite happiness, something adjacent to both. The specific feeling of a day that had asked more than it had any right to ask and had given back more than he'd expected. "Can I keep that?" he said. Emma looked at him. "It's mine," she said. "But you can have a copy." She tore a clean sheet from her notebook and slid it across the table. He sat down, picked up her colored pencil, and drew a T-Rex that was objectively worse than hers. She watched him with critical professional focus and did not pretend otherwise. Outside, Garrett City went about its evening. The streetlights coming on, the November air settling toward cold, the Titan Automotive building lit up and visible from certain angles, its highest floors burning white against a sky that had finally gone dark. Somewhere on the 5th floor, a server stored a file that had been preserved rather than erased, containing a record of things that had been done wrong and the man who had identified them. Somewhere on sublevel 3, the Titan 12 sat on its platform, operational and correct, running the way it had been designed to run from the beginning. And in a small apartment on the north side of the city, a man who had been thrown away and found his way back sat at a kitchen table drawing dinosaurs with his daughter, and let himself feel, for the first time in a long time, that the ground under his feet was solid. The offer arrived in his email at 9:47 that night. Marcus had sent it with a short, characteristically efficient note. "Please review at your convenience. Ms. Sterling is available tomorrow morning if you have questions." Nolan read it at the kitchen table after Emma was asleep, the apartment quiet except for the monitor on the counter and the fluorescent light doing its usual faint flicker above him. He'd made tea. Not because he particularly wanted tea, but because reading a document that was going to change the shape of your life felt like it deserved something warmer than water. He read the offer twice. The title was exactly what Isabella had described: Chief Systems Engineer, a newly created position reporting directly to the CEO. The compensation was 3 times what he'd been making as a maintenance technician, which he'd expected intellectually and still felt strange to see in print. The language about schedule flexibility was there, specific and contractual, not vague company policy language, but actual written terms. Employee retains full discretion over daily schedule, including school pickup, medical appointments, and family obligations, provided project deliverables are met. Someone had been careful about that. He suspected Isabella had written it herself rather than leaving it to the legal team. There was also a section he hadn't expected. Under intellectual property acknowledgement, the document contained formal language recognizing his contribution to the calibration architecture underlying the Titan 12, with a clause committing the company to include his name in all technical publications, patent applications, and public documentation related to the project going forward. The Vance Systems history was described as the subject of ongoing legal review, which was lawyer speak for a process that hadn't concluded yet, but it was in writing. His name was in writing. He sat with that for a while. He thought about the notebooks, all 12 of them, stacked in the second drawer of his desk in the small room he used as an office/storage/the place where Emma's art projects went to live permanently because she assigned them sentimental value and he didn't have the heart to rotate them out. 12 notebooks full of diagrams and observations and ideas, and a lot of late-night math done by a man who kept working on problems even when nobody was paying him to, because the work was real regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. He picked up a pen and signed the offer. He started officially 3 weeks later, which was enough time for Titan's legal and communications teams to prepare what Isabella described, with deliberate understatement, as a public clarification of events. It was more than a clarification. It was a 12-page formal statement released simultaneously to the automotive trade press, the financial wire services, and the 2 international partners who had issued concern notices after the failed demonstration. The statement documented the full timeline: the original calibration flaw, Nolan's dismissed reports, the retaliatory termination, Victor Lang's deliberate modifications, the log alterations, and the successful correction. It named Nolan Pierce by name, repeatedly and accurately. The trade press ran with it. The story was, in the cold calculus of news coverage, genuinely compelling. Corporate fraud, a wrongfully fired technician, a CEO who dug into her own company's failures instead of burying them. Several outlets framed it as a story about institutional whistleblowing. One automotive industry publication ran the headline, "The engineer they fired was the only one who could fix it." Nolan read it on his phone over breakfast while Emma ate cereal and told him about a disagreement she was having with her friend Priya over the correct plural of mongoose. Mongooses, Emma said firmly. "I think it might be mongoose," Nolan said without looking up. "That sounds made up." "Most words sound made up if you think about them long enough." Emma considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's kind of true," she admitted. He put his phone down. The headline sat in his notification bar, and he didn't look at it again that morning. Not because it didn't matter. It did matter, more than he found easy to explain, but because breakfast with Emma mattered more, and he'd learned, slowly and imperfectly over 4 years of doing this alone, to keep those things in their proper order. His first day back in the building was not the ordeal he'd braced for, which was somehow its own kind of strange. Isabella had arranged it without making a production of it, which was the right call. He came in through the main entrance, the first time since his termination, the first time since the lobby, since Emma's hand in his, and the sound of someone laughing. The reception desk was staffed by a different person than Keeley, who'd moved to a different department, though he saw her in the hallway later that morning, and she waved. The lobby looked the same, the framed product history wall, the high ceilings and the pale institutional light. He walked through it at 8 a.m. with his notebook under his arm and his visitor credentials, temporary, while HR processed his full reinstatement. And he felt the weight of the space the way you feel a place where something difficult happened. Not dramatically, just present, the way certain rooms stay with you. Marcus was waiting near the elevator. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce, Mum. Your office is on the 4th floor. Ms. Sterling asked me to walk you up." "You don't have to do that." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm doing it anyway." They rode up together. 4th floor, the floor he'd been summoned to in November for his termination, the floor with the conference rooms and the HR suite, and the corner office where Isabella had been up at 4:30 the morning after the demo failed, reading files she hadn't known existed the day before. His office was not a corner office. It was a reasonable-sized interior room with a window that looked onto the inner courtyard, a drafting table someone had brought up from engineering, and a whiteboard that was conspicuously clean, pristine, newly installed, waiting. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "There's a credenza coming this afternoon," Marcus said. "Ms. Sterling thought you'd want somewhere to store physical documentation." "Tell her she's right," Nolan said. He went in, set his notebook on the drafting table, looked at the whiteboard. Then he picked up a marker and started writing. The first 3 months were not a triumph narrative. That's important to say because the truth of rebuilding something, a program, a company's engineering culture, a person's professional life, is that it is mostly incremental and often tedious and full of moments where the gap between where you are and where you're trying to get feels too wide to reasonably cross. Nolan's job was, at its core, to rebuild the Titan 12 program from a foundation that had been compromised, not just technically, but institutionally. The calibration fix had been the straightforward part. What came after was harder, a complete audit of every design decision made under Victor Lang's oversight, cross-referenced against documentation that in some cases was incomplete or had been strategically allowed to become incomplete. He built a new validation protocol from scratch. He rewrote the calibration standards. He established a system of independent technical review that didn't route through a single authorizing VP, which meant redesigning the approval structure in ways that created friction with people who had benefited from the old structure. He wasn't universally liked. He hadn't expected to be. There were engineers in the division who had worked with Victor for years and viewed Nolan's arrival, and the circumstances of it, with a combination of resentment and defensive discomfort. One senior engineer, a capable and technically sharp man named Frank Devereaux, made it quietly but consistently clear that he considered Nolan an outsider who'd gotten his position through a political crisis rather than a proper process. Nolan didn't argue with him. He just did the work and answered Frank's technical challenges with technical answers and waited for the work to speak for itself. It took about 6 weeks for Frank's resistance to shift from active to neutral. Another 4 before it became something that, if not quite collegial, was at least functional and occasionally useful. Progress was slow. That was fine. Slow was honest. Isabella checked in regularly, not hovering but present. She had the quality of a person who was genuinely interested in understanding things rather than just managing them, which Nolan found unusual enough in someone at her level that he noticed it. She asked real questions, not briefing room questions. She pushed back when she disagreed, which was more often than he'd expected and which he respected. They argued occasionally. Not badly. No one raised their voice, but substantively about engineering priorities and resource allocation and the pace of the audit process, which Isabella wanted to accelerate and Nolan wanted to do completely. And the tension between those two valid things was not always comfortable. After one of those arguments, a Tuesday afternoon in his office, over the timeline for the revised validation protocol, she'd stood up to leave and then paused at the door. "You don't back down," she said. It wasn't a complaint, it was more like something she was cataloging. "Neither do you," he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was still learning to read. It had layers, Isabella's expressions, and they didn't always mean what they initially appeared to. "That's not a bad combination," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She left. He went back to the timeline. He moved 3 items and held firm on 2 others and sent her the revised version that evening, and she responded with fine. "But I want the interim results by the end of February," and he wrote back. "End of February is doable if IT stops losing archive requests," and she wrote back, "I'll talk to IT," and that was how most of their disagreements ended. Not with one person winning and one person losing, but with the problem getting solved in a way neither of them had originally proposed. He didn't know what to call what they were to each other in those months. Colleagues was accurate but incomplete. Something was developing in the space between them, not declared, not rushed, not simple. They were both people who had learned to be careful about things that mattered, and neither of them moved quickly toward anything that required trust they hadn't fully established yet. But he noticed things. The way she listened, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually taking in what he was saying, and sometimes changing her position based on it, which in his experience was rarer than it should have been. The way she talked about the company, not like an asset she was managing, but like something she'd accepted responsibility for, with all the complicated weight that entailed. The fact that she remembered, consistently, that Emma existed and had a schedule and was a real presence in his life, and incorporated that into how she worked with him without ever making it feel like accommodation. And he noticed, one morning in January, that he'd been looking forward to getting to work in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. Not because the work was easy, but because it was his, and because the room he was working in was one where he was known accurately. Victor Lang was formally charged in February. The charges were fraud, intellectual property theft, and deliberate falsification of corporate records. 3 counts, the last of which carried significant weight because it implicated the failed demo and the subsequent financial damages. His legal team had spent January attempting to negotiate a resolution that would minimize public exposure, and had failed because Isabella and Titan's legal team had documentation comprehensive enough that negotiation from a position of genuine leverage wasn't available to him. He didn't take it well. There was a statement, released through his lawyers, carefully worded, that characterized the situation as a misunderstanding of creative attribution in collaborative engineering environments and suggested that the charges reflected organizational politics rather than actual misconduct. The statement was picked up by a couple of outlets who ran it as a sidebar to the larger story, and it generated approximately 48 hours of minor controversy before the weight of the documented evidence made it irrelevant. Nolan read the statement once. He didn't respond to the one journalist who contacted him for comment, and he didn't discuss it with anyone at work. He had a protocol review to finish and a calibration standards document due to the board, and he didn't have the time or the particular desire to give Victor Lang's version of events more space in his head than it had already occupied. What he felt reading it, was more complicated than he'd expected. He thought he'd feel satisfaction, not vindictive, but something clean and concluded. What he actually felt was tired and a little sad, in the way you feel sad about waste. Victor Lang had been, by every account Nolan could piece together, a genuinely capable engineer at some earlier point in his career. Somewhere along the way, the need to protect his position had outgrown his willingness to do honest work. And the gap between those two things had widened until it became the thing that defined him. Nolan thought about his own years. The notebooks, the quiet maintenance work, the decision to take the stable job instead of fighting for what was his. He'd made his own accommodations with circumstances. He'd swallowed things he shouldn't have. He wasn't sure he was in a position to feel superior about any of it, and he didn't. What he did feel, clearly and without ambiguity, was that he was glad he hadn't become what Victor had become. The cost of that, years of unacknowledged work, a termination, a humiliation in front of a lobby full of people, had been real. But the alternative cost would have been harder to live with. He finished the protocol review. He sent the calibration document to the board. He picked up Emma from school at 3:30 and listened to her explain the ongoing diplomatic situation between herself and Priya, which had evolved from the mongoose dispute into a broader disagreement about the classification of birds as a subset of dinosaurs, which Emma considered settled science, and Priya considered open for debate. "She's wrong," Emma said. "Birds are dinosaurs, that's just true." "Priya might need more time with the evidence," Nolan said. Emma considered this. "How much time?" "More than a week, probably." Emma sighed with the patience of someone who has accepted that the world operates more slowly than it should. "Fine," she said. The board approved the public credit statement in March. It was a formal corporate announcement, not a press release, an official statement filed with the relevant industry bodies and included in the company's annual engineering report, acknowledging Nolan Pierce as a primary contributor to the calibration architecture underlying the Titan 12 engine system. The statement cited the Vance Systems development records, the original technical documentation, and the independent IP review that had been completed over the preceding months. His name, in print, on the record that mattered. Marcus brought him a copy in his office on a Thursday morning, placed it on the drafting table without ceremony, and said, "Ms. Sterling thought you'd want a hard copy." Nolan picked it up, read it, set it down. "Tell her thank you," he said. Marcus nodded and left. Nolan looked at the document for a moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out one of his notebooks, number 12, the most recent, and tucked the document inside the front cover. He told Isabella in November that he kept the notebooks because the work was real, regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. That was true. It had always been true, and it didn't stop being true because the acknowledgement had finally come. But the acknowledgement mattered anyway. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. It mattered to him in a way that was harder to articulate than the clean principle of work for its own sake, harder and more human, the part of a person that needs to be seen, that keeps records not just for practical reasons, but because writing something down is a way of saying, "This happened, this was real, I was here, he'd been here." The record said so now. He went back to work. The formal launch of the Titan 12 happened in early May, 7 months after the failed demonstration and 11 months after Nolan had first noticed the variance in the calibration logs. It was not a modest event. Titan had learned from the November disaster that the way you recover from a public failure is not to minimize but to be unambiguous, to make the correction as visible as the failure had been. The launch was held at the main facility in the large demonstration hall that had been repaired and reconfigured since November. Investors, media, industry partners. 47 of the same people who'd been in the room when the engine failed were invited back specifically, a decision Isabella had made that some of her board members found uncomfortably confrontational, and that Nolan, when she told him, thought was exactly right. He was not a public-facing person. He didn't give speeches. He didn't do press. He'd made that clear early, and Isabella had respected it. His presence at the launch was as an engineer. He would stand near the test station during the demonstration run, available to answer technical questions from partners who had them, which was his preferred version of visibility. Emma came. This had been Emma's idea, stated at dinner 2 weeks before the launch, with the same matter-of-fact confidence she brought to all proposals she considered self-evidently correct. "I want to see the engine," she said. "The one you fixed." "It's going to be a long evening," Nolan said. "Lots of adults talking." "I know, I still want to go." He'd cleared it with Isabella, who had said of course with an immediacy that suggested she'd have been surprised if he'd asked otherwise. Marcus had arranged a seat for Emma in the front row of the guest area, which was where the invited back investors were seated, and had also, apparently on his own initiative, sourced a printed program with Emma's name on it, which Emma had examined with great seriousness and declared acceptable. The demonstration hall was loud with the particular energy of an event that has something to prove. Nolan could feel it in the room, not the nervous edge of November, but something more directed. People who had been disappointed before and were here to see whether that disappointment had been addressed. He stood at the test station with the lead validation engineer, a young woman named Christine Park, who had joined the Titan 12 team in January and had quickly become one of the most precise technical minds Nolan had worked with in years. Christine had her tablet and her monitoring equipment and the focused, slightly combative energy of someone who had run this sequence 22 times in the past month and was going to run it correctly the 23rd time in front of whoever showed up. "You're calm," she told Nolan, glancing at him while she ran her pre-demonstration check. "I know what the engine is going to do, he said. "You always say that." "I'm always right." She almost smiled. "Don't jinx it." "That's not how engineering works, Christine." "I know. I'm still saying don't jinx it." From across the room, he found Emma in the front row. She was sitting between two investor types who were 3 times her size, and she was reading her printed program with complete composure, her Planet backpack on the seat beside her because she'd refused to check it, and occasionally she looked up to observe the room with the expression of someone who is taking in information and filing it away. She caught his eye. He raised his chin slightly. She gave him a small nod. Serious, deliberate. The nod of someone who is acknowledging that they have received the signal and are ready. He turned back to the engine. "Look." Isabella spoke first. She was good at this, not in the polished way of someone who had practiced the charisma out of their presentation, but in the straightforward way of someone who knew exactly what they were saying and why it mattered. She told the room what had happened, not a sanitized version, the real version. The failed demonstration, the dismissed reports, the fraud, the correction, the man who had made the correction possible. She used Nolan's name 3 times. She used the phrase "we got it wrong" twice, without hedging, without the passive voice institutional language that lets organizations avoid accountability by making it structureless. There were people in that room who had lost money in November. There were people who had been angry and remained angry. She spoke to all of them, not around them. When she finished, there was applause. Not the reflexive kind, the kind that comes from a room that has decided something. Then the engine ran. Christine initiated the sequence, and the Titan 12 came up through its stages, the building vibration, the deepening sound, the displays climbing through their ranges, and Nolan stood at the console and watched the numbers, and every number was where it should be, and the engine ran for 20 minutes at full demonstration output without a single deviation from baseline parameters. The room was quiet during those 20 minutes, the specific quiet of people watching something they need to see with their own eyes after being told about it. When it shut down, the applause was loud enough that Nolan felt it in his sternum. He stepped back from the console. Christine was already logging the final readings, professional and focused, doing her job. He looked across the room to the front row. Emma was standing, not clapping. She was watching the engine with an expression he had never quite seen on her face before. Not the excited bounce of the field trip, not the dinosaur explaining intensity. Something older, something that had taken in the whole evening, the room, the people, the engine, her father standing in the middle of it, and understood what it added up to. He walked over to her. She looked up at him when he reached her. "It worked," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It worked. Because you fixed it. I fixed part of it. A lot of people fixed parts of it." She looked at him with the expression she used when she knew he was being more modest than the situation warranted. "Daddy?" "Okay," he said. "Yes, I fixed the important part." She considered this. Then she reached over and took his hand. Not the small, urgent grip of the day he'd walked out of this building, but a different kind. "Steady. deliberate. Mom would have thought this was really cool, she said. He looked at his daughter. 7 years old now. She'd turned 7 in March, with a dinosaur-themed party that she had planned herself, and which had involved a level of logistical detail that had genuinely impressed him. She said things sometimes that landed in the exact center of where he kept the things he didn't take out very often. Yeah, he said. She would have. She would have made a sign, Emma said, a really embarrassing one. She absolutely would have, he agreed. Emma leaned against his arm briefly, the way she did sometimes, without making it a moment, just a contact. Then she straightened up. Can I talk to the engine people? Christine told me she'd explain the thermal coupling thing. You talked to Christine? She came over while you were at the station. She said I asked good questions. He looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said. Go talk to Christine. She was off before he'd finished the sentence, threading through the room with her Planet backpack and her printed program, heading toward Christine with the focused purpose of someone who has a specific technical question and is going to get it answered. He watched her go. Chan. Isabella found him near the back of the room, 20 minutes later, after the formal portion of the evening had dissolved into the looser social current of guests talking to each other in clusters. She had a glass of water and the particular quality of someone who has just delivered something difficult and well and is now in the first few minutes of being able to breathe. Christine is explaining modulation arrays to your daughter, she said. I know, I can see them. Emma asked whether the thermal coupling failure in November would be considered a phase transition or a cascade event. She looked at him. Christine looked genuinely surprised. Emma's been reading the technical summary I left on the counter. I thought she was using it as a placemat. Isabella looked at him. She was probably doing both. He almost laughed. Actually, almost. They stood together watching the room. The investors, the engineers, the industry partners moving around each other. The demonstration hall that had been a disaster 7 months ago and was now evidence of something having been corrected. Not perfectly. Things didn't get corrected perfectly, but genuinely, which was the part that counted. How are you feeling? Isabella said. Not a performance of caring, an actual question. He thought about it. Complicated, he said. Good complicated, not bad complicated. That's probably accurate. It's weird, he said, standing in a room where 6 months ago I walked out of this building with my daughter's hand and I didn't know what was going to happen. And now, he stopped, tried again. I'm not sure I have a word for what now is. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the room. I don't think it needs a word yet, she said. I think it can just be what it is. He looked at her. The low lighting of the hall caught the side of her face. The tiredness that was still there, functional and managed. The very unglossy reality of a person who had spent 7 months doing hard and complicated work and had done it well without anyone cleaning it up for them. Isabella, he said. Yes? He didn't say anything for a moment. There were things he was working toward in his own slow, careful way, and she knew it, and she was working toward them too, in her own way. That understanding had been building between them for months, in the particular incremental way of two people who both have reasons to be careful and are choosing to be careful well, not as an avoidance, but as a kind of patience. Thank you, he said, for calling me. She turned to look at him fully. That night, she said. Yeah. I almost didn't, she said. I told you that. I know. I'm glad I did, she said. So am I, he said. They stood there a moment longer, not quite touching, not at the distance of strangers. Something in between, which was where they were, which was fine, which was honest. Across the room, Emma had produced her notebook from her Planet backpack and was writing something while Christine talked, the focused and slightly aggressive note-taking of a person who intends to fully understand what they're being told. Christine was pointing at a diagram on her tablet. Emma was nodding and writing at the same time. Nolan watched his daughter and felt the specific quality of a moment that was going to mean something later, the kind of moment you recognize while it's happening and don't try to make more than it is. He thought about everything that had brought them here, the work that had been done in obscurity, and the work that had been done wrong. The notebooks in his desk drawer, The first job, Advanced Systems. The young man who stayed up late arguing about tolerances because the math mattered. The years between then and now, the loss, the grinding forward motion, the decisions he'd made that he didn't feel good about, the decision he'd finally made that he did. Emma in the lobby in November with her planet backpack, telling him about Saturn's moons, not knowing the day was as bad as it was. He thought about Claire, not with the familiar ache of absence, but with the specific feeling of showing her something. Look, I'm showing you this, the way you show someone you love a thing you made, even when they can't be in the room. She had told him the work was worth doing regardless of whether anyone was watching. He'd believed her eventually, and then he'd stopped believing, and then the circumstances had conspired to prove her right anyway, which was something she would have found funny and also self-evident and would have said "I told you" about, repeatedly and with great satisfaction. He smiled at that. Briefly, privately, to no one but her. Emma looked up across the room and caught him smiling and tilted her head in the slightly suspicious way she had when she was trying to figure out what she'd missed. He shook his head. Nothing. She looked unconvinced but turned back to Christine. The engine sat at the center of the hall behind its safety barriers, quiet now, the way it had been quiet in the test bay in November when he'd stood in front of it and read it the way you read something written in a language you grew up with. It would run again tomorrow and the day after, and it would keep running because the foundation had been corrected, because someone had insisted on finding the true problem even when the institution had done everything it could to prevent that from happening. That was the thing about truth. It was inconvenient, and it was stubborn, and it had a way of surfacing regardless of what was done to suppress it, through the work of ordinary people who kept their records and refused, quietly and without drama, to pretend a wrong thing was right. Nobody handed you credit for that. Nobody put your name on it while it was happening. You did it because you were the person who knew, and knowing carried its own obligations. Nolan Pierce had learned that slowly and expensively, and he was still learning it, the way people keep learning the same essential thing in different shapes throughout their lives. He was 32 years old in a gray shirt when this started. Well, 33 now, since November, and the shirt was a different one. The shape of his life looked different than it had from either side of the last 12 months. Not perfect, not resolved in all the ways it could still stand to be resolved. There was more work ahead, more arguments with Isabella about timelines and resource allocation, more nights when Emma had nightmares and he couldn't get back to sleep and worked at the kitchen table until 4:30. There was a legal process that had months left in it. There was a daughter who was going to keep growing and asking questions he couldn't fully answer and drawing T-Rexes that were better than his. There was a woman across the room in a room full of people who had made a phone call when she could have let it all slide, and who had been honest when it would have been easier to manage, and who was, in all the imperfect ways that counted, someone he was going to know for a long time. The fluorescent lights in the demonstration hall were better than the one in his kitchen. He still needed to replace that one. He'd been meaning to for 7 months. He took out his notebook, the 12th one, the one with the board statement tucked inside the front cover, and opened it to a clean page. He wrote the date, then the time. Then, in the shorthand he used when he was noting something real, something he wanted to make sure existed in the record. Engine ran, all nominal. Emma took notes. The work was worth it. He closed the notebook, picked it up, walked across the demonstration hall toward his daughter, who had finished her questions, and was now looking at him with the patient expression of someone who has been waiting and has decided the waiting is concluded. "Ready?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go home." She took his hand. They walked out of the hall together. Not through a side door, not through a service entrance, not with anyone watching them go and making quiet comments. Through the main door, the same door the investors and the journalists and the international partners used, into the May evening where the air had finally turned warm after a long winter. The Garrett City sky a clear dark blue above the parking lot lights. Emma stopped on the steps and looked up. "There are more stars than usual," she said. "Probably just less cloud cover." "I know why there are more stars. I'm just saying there are more of them." She kept looking up. "Saturn's up there somewhere." "Yeah," he said. "It is." 62 moons, she said. "Probably more." He stood beside her on the steps of the building that had fired him and brought him back and put his name where it belonged, And he looked up at the sky with his daughter, and he let himself feel the full weight of where they were and how they'd gotten there. Not rushing past it, not managing it, just standing inside it for a moment like a person who has earned the right to stop moving for 30 seconds and simply be present in his own life. Then Emma squeezed his hand. "Okay," she said. "Now I'm ready." They walked to the car. Behind them, the Titan Automotive building held its light against the sky. Inside, the engine sat in its hall, correct and whole, and running exactly as designed. Not because the institution had protected it, but because one man had refused to walk away from what he knew was true. There was no monument to that, no plaque, no ceremony, just the record and the work, and the fact that it was done, which had always been enough, which would always be enough, which is, in the end, the only kind of enough that actually lasts.